I'm going to talk to you about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the main point for this is the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis portrays how close America came to engaging in a nuclear war with Russia that was only controlled by strategic thinking on the part of our nation's leaders. So first off, the events leading into the Cuban Missile Crisis was a U-2 aircraft that was flying over Cuba, noticed objects on Cuba, and started taking pictures. These pictures were then sent to be analyzed uh, by those who know the specifics of the U-2 aircraft. After analyzing and finding out that the objects on Cuba was short ballistic missiles, the pictures were then sent to President John F. Kennedy at that time. The two major heads of this time was John F. Kennedy, like I said, and for the U.S., and Khrushchev for Russia. When John F. Kennedy fully comprehended this, he gathered his closest advisors to consider all the options that could be taken to counteract the short ballistic missiles that they found on Cuba. So his reactions for this, when considering options, was first an airstrike followed by a U.S. invasion 8 days later. And then the second one was a stern warning to Cuba and Russia for having missiles on Cuba. Kennedy decided to take a middle ground between these two and decided to do a quarantine on Cuba, which is another way of saying blockade without engaging the actions of a blockade, because a blockade was considered an act of war. And a quote from the Office of Historian is, "The use of quarantine legally distinguishes this action from a blockade, which assumes a state of war existed. The use of quarantine instead of a blockade enables the U.S. to receive the support of the organizations of America's states." So the events that led to the closure of the Cuban Missile Crisis was first, Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev demanding the removal of the missiles from Cuba. After this, JFK advises America of the quarantine. Shortly after the quarantine was set, Khrushchev saw the quarantine as an act of aggression and continued ships to Cuba regardless of the blockade, even though the ships were stopped and searched for any offensive weaponry, and if not, then they were able to move on to Cuba if it was normal supplies, like food and whatnot. So on October 26th, Khrushchev sent a message to President Kennedy and his advisors that he was willing to make a deal to basically remove the missiles from Cuba. But shortly after the first message was sent on the 26th of October, on the October 27th, another message was sent to Kennedy, including the details of removing U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. So Attorney General Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, meets with the Russian-Soviet ambassador in regards to Turkey missiles. On October 28th, Khrushchev issued a statement that Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. And the events after the Cuban Missile Crisis that were positive from this. A direct telephone link was established between the White House and Kremlin, which was called a hotline. The US and Russia took steps to agree on a nuclear test ban treaty. Also, the US removes missiles on in April of 1963 from Turkey, which was a part of the original deal. So, in conclusion, I introduced you to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the events leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and actions that were taken to further prevent any conflict, and along with the events that ended the crisis and positive results.